You know how they say you don't know what you have until it's gone? I used to roll my eyes at that saying. Thought it was something people said to make themselves feel better about their poor choices. Turns out, I was the one who didn't understand a damn thing. I'm Amelia Parker, and this is the story of how I lost the best man I've ever known because I was too blind to see what was right in front of me. It's been 3 years since that night at Romano's, and I still wake up some mornings expecting to find Jeremy next to me, humming some old jazz standard while he plans his day. Jeremy and I met at a bookstore's. I was 25, working as a secretary at a law firm, convinced I was worldly because I lived in the city and wore shoulder pads that could take someone's eye out. He was 27, browsing the poetry section, completely absorbed in Pablo Neruda. I approached him because he was gorgeous. Dark hair, incredible green eyes, and this smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours. We talked about books, music, whether happiness was something you found or created. When he walked me home, he didn't try to kiss me or invite himself up. He just asked if he could see me again, like spending time with me was a privilege. We were married 18 months later. Jeremy worked as a music teacher at the elementary school. He'd come home with stories about kids discovering they could make beautiful sounds, about shy children finding their voices. In the evenings, he'd sit at our old upright piano and play jazz standards, classical pieces, songs he'd compose on the spot. Sometimes I'd curl up with a book, half reading and half listening to him work through melodies. Jeremy wasn't traditionally masculine, and I knew that from the start. He cried during movies, loved cooking elaborate Sunday dinners, grew herbs on our windowsill. He read poetry before bed and kept a journal where he wrote down things that moved him. Overheard conversations, the way morning light fell across our kitchen table, lyrics that caught his attention. For the first few years, I loved all of this about him. I felt like I'd won some kind of lottery. My friends would complain about husbands who came home, grabbed a beer, and planted themselves in front of the television. Meanwhile, Jeremy would ask about my day like he genuinely wanted to know, then share stories about his students' breakthroughs. But somewhere around our 4th year, things started to shift. Maybe it was constant exposure to other people's opinions, but I began to see Jeremy differently. It started with small moments of irritation. We'd be at barbecues, and the men would cluster around the grill talking about sports, while Jeremy would be inside helping arrange flowers or discussing olive oils. I'd watch him through the kitchen window, animated and engaged, and feel strange embarrassment creep up my neck. My sister Helen didn't help. She'd married Frank, who worked construction and spent weekends fixing things or teaching their sons baseball. Helen would make comments about how nice it must be to have such a sensitive husband, but there was always an edge that made it sound like she really meant soft. Jeremy's such a sweetheart, helping with dishes and all, she'd say. Frank would laugh if I asked him to do that. Then she'd laugh herself. Like having a husband who viewed household tasks as beneath him was charming. My coworkers were worse. I'd mentioned that Jeremy had taken up gardening, that he'd spent Saturday afternoon planting roses. The women in the break room exchanged glances. "How nice," said Patricia, in that tone that meant anything but. "My husband can barely remember to take out the trash." "At least you know where he is on weekends," added Linda. "Mine's always off with his buddies." They made it sound like Jeremy's presence in our home, his investment in making our life beautiful, was somehow less masculine than their husband's absence. And God help me, I started to believe them. I began paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. How Jeremy's voice got softer when he was excited. How he'd spend 20 minutes at the farmer's market talking about heirloom tomatoes like it was fascinating. These weren't new behaviors, but now instead of feeling grateful, I felt embarrassed. The worst part was how I started treating him. Little cuts at first. When he'd get excited about a new recipe, I'd roll my eyes and suggest ordering pizza. When he'd ask if I wanted to hear a song his student composed, I'd glance at the clock and sigh about how late it was. I stopped asking about his day. When he'd come home full of stories about his student's progress, I'd offer distracted mm-hms while focusing on television or magazines. I convinced myself I was just tired, that this was normal for couples. But it wasn't comfort I was feeling. It was resentment. Resentment that my husband wasn't more like other husbands, that he didn't fit the mold I'd somehow decided he should fit. The breaking point came at my office Christmas party in December 1991. Jeremy wore a burgundy velvet jacket that looked stunning on him. But as soon as we walked into the hotel ballroom, I noticed Patricia's husband glance at Jeremy's jacket and whisper to the man next to him. They both snickered. Jeremy didn't notice. He was admiring the decorations, complimenting people's outfits, asking thoughtful questions about their families. He was being himself, kind, observant, genuinely interested. And I was mortified. I spent the entire evening seeing Jeremy through other people's eyes. His enthusiasm for decorations, his conversation with Linda about her daughter's piano lessons, the way he'd step aside to let someone pass with a gentle smile instead of an aggressive shoulder bump. When we got home, Jeremy was still buzzing with happiness. He'd had genuine conversations, discovered that our accountant was also a jazz enthusiast, been invited to a concert. "I really like your colleagues," he said, hanging up his jacket carefully. "That woman Linda has such interesting stories. And did you know Mr. Henderson plays saxophone?" I was pulling off my pantyhose with unnecessary force. "You talk to people all night." "Well, yes, that's what you do at parties, isn't it?" Most men don't spend 20 minutes discussing Christmas decorations with their wife's boss. Jeremy was quiet for a moment. "I thought the decorations were beautiful. Mrs. Patterson put a lot of effort into them." "They're artificial, Jeremy, fake snow and plastic holly. But they created something lovely. Why does it matter what they're made of?" I couldn't explain why it mattered, because I didn't really know. That night was the beginning of the end. I started declining social invitations, claiming to be tired. When we did go out, I'd find myself watching Jeremy constantly, cringing when he'd comment on someone's garden or offer to help carry something. At home, I became critical in ways I'd never been before. When he'd spend Saturday mornings tending roses, I'd comment about more productive ways to spend time. When he'd play piano after dinner, I'd mention that neighbors might appreciate quiet. Jeremy noticed, of course. He started asking if everything was okay, if he'd upset me. His concern was genuine and patient, which somehow made it worse. I wanted him to get angry, to show some aggression. Instead, he became quieter. The spontaneous concerts grew less frequent. He stopped sharing stories unless I specifically asked. He still tended his garden and cooked elaborate meals, but there was a careful quality to his enthusiasm now, like he was testing each gesture to see if it would be welcomed or criticized. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Friday night in March. My friend Carol had suggested we meet at Romano's, this Italian place downtown. Carol was married to Bruce, who sold real estate and spent weekends watching sports. Also joining us were my sister Helen and her husband Frank, plus Janet and Bill. Janet was a nurse married to Bill, who managed a hardware store and had opinions about everything. I'd been spending more time with this group, partly because being around them made my growing dissatisfaction with Jeremy feel normal, even justified. These women had husbands who forgot anniversaries and had to be asked 3 times to take out garbage. Surely that was preferable to having a husband who remembered your favorite flowers. Jeremy hadn't wanted to come. I could tell from how his shoulders tensed when I mentioned dinner plans. But I insisted, telling him it would be good for us to socialize. What I really meant was that I wanted him to see how other men behaved. We arrived at Romano's after 7. The group had claimed a large round table, already well into their first drinks. "Jeremy," Carol called out too loudly. "Look at you, all dressed up." Jeremy had worn a navy sweater and khakis. Nothing fancy, but he made simple clothes look elegant. He smiled politely and asked about Carol's mother, who'd been in the hospital. "Oh, she's much better, thanks for asking," Carol said. But I saw her exchange a glance with Janet. Jeremy's concern always seemed to surprise them. The conversation started pleasantly. We talked about work, the unusually warm weather, a new movie getting good reviews. Jeremy contributed thoughtfully, asking follow-up questions and sharing relevant stories. But as the wine flowed, the tone began to shift. Frank started talking about a deck construction project requiring heavy machinery and manual labor. "Good thing I don't need help," Frank said, glancing around. "Most guys today wouldn't know a 2x4 from a tennis racket." Bill laughed. "Tell me about it." "I had a customer ask if we sold gentle hammers." "That's nothing," Bruce chimed in. "I showed a house to this couple, and the husband spent the whole time asking about the garden. Not the foundation, the garden. Wanted to know about soil, whether there was enough sun for roses." Jeremy's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully and took a sip of water. Helen jumped in. "Speaking of gardens, Jeremy, how are those roses of yours doing?" There was something in her tone that made my stomach clench. I could see where this was heading, but I didn't stop it. "They're doing well," Jeremy said quietly. "I planted some new varieties last fall." "How lovely," said Janet, voice dripping false sweetness. "Bill here can barely keep our lawn alive." "Too busy with actual work, I suppose," Bill grinned. "Hey, that's what landscapers are for. I've got better things to do than play in the dirt." "Different people find fulfillment in different activities," Jeremy said, his voice calm but with an edge I recognized. "I find gardening peaceful, therapeutic." Frank snorted. "Therapeutic? That's one way to put it." "What's that supposed to mean?" Jeremy asked. The table went quiet. Frank looked around, checking his audience. "Nothing, man. It's just most guys I know, when they want therapy. They go fishing or work on cars or hit golf balls. They don't spend weekends planting pansies." The word pansies hung in the air like a bad smell. I should have said something, should have defended my husband. Instead, I looked down at my plate. Carol laughed harshly. "Oh, come on, Frank. There's nothing wrong with a man who knows his way around a flower bed. It just shows he's in touch with his feminine side." "Very in touch," Helen added. And the laughter that followed felt cruel. Jeremy's face had gone pale. "I enjoy creating beautiful things. I don't see how that's feminine or masculine. It's just human." "Sure," said Bill. "But you have to admit, it's not exactly typical guy behavior. What's next? Knitting?" More laughter. I felt Jeremy look at me, waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't meet his eyes. Some terrible part of me was almost relieved that someone else was finally saying what I'd been thinking. "There's nothing wrong with having hobbies," I said finally, but my voice was weak. "Hobbies, sure," Frank said. "But when a man spends more time on his appearance than his wife does, what does that mean?" Jeremy's voice was sharper now. Frank shrugged. "Just saying. Carol told us about your skincare routine, face masks and all that. It's very modern." I wanted to disappear. I'd mentioned Jeremy's skincare routine to Carol during a girls' lunch, complaining about how he spent 20 minutes in the bathroom every morning. At the time, it had seemed harmless. Now it felt like betrayal. "Taking care of yourself isn't vanity," Jeremy said. "It's self-respect." "Self-respect," Bruce repeated, like he was tasting the words. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Janet leaned forward, eyes bright with alcohol and malice. "Oh, don't be so sensitive, Jeremy. We're just teasing. It's sweet that you're so domestic." "Domestic," Jeremy repeated. "You know, cooking, cleaning, decorating. All those things that come naturally to you." The implication was clear, and I could see it hit Jeremy like a physical blow. His hands were clenched in his lap. "I see." "Oh, lighten up," Carol said. "We're just having fun. Besides, Amelia doesn't seem to mind having a husband who's more homemaker than breadwinner." That wasn't true. Jeremy made decent money as a teacher, but the comment was designed to wound, and it worked. I saw Jeremy's jaw tighten as he glanced around the table at these people who were supposed to be our friends. "Actually," Helen said, "I've always wondered, how does that work in the bedroom?" "When the man is more Helen," I said finally, finding my voice. But it was too late. Jeremy stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped against the floor. The noise cut through the restaurant's chatter, and nearby tables turned to look. "You want to know how it works?" Jeremy's voice was quiet but carried across the room. I'll tell you how it works. Frank started to say something, but Jeremy cut him off. Frank, you're talking about masculinity, while your wife told us she's been doing your laundry for 20 years because you can't figure out how to separate colors from whites. You're 43 and can't wash your own clothes. Frank's face flushed red, but Jeremy wasn't finished. Bruce, you spent 10 minutes bragging about your deal, but didn't mention that Carol balances your checkbook because you bounced 3 checks last month buying golf equipment you can't afford. Bruce opened his mouth to protest, but Jeremy turned to Bill. Bill, you think real men don't care about gardens, but Janet told us you cried for an hour because you accidentally ran over a squirrel with your lawnmower. Which is fine, by the way. The table was dead silent. Other diners had stopped eating to watch. And you, Jeremy said, looking at Janet. You think it's funny that I care about my appearance, but you spend 2 hours getting ready every morning and have asked Carol 5 times tonight if your lipstick is smudged. Janet's hand flew to her mouth automatically. Jeremy's voice was getting louder, his composure finally cracking. You want to talk about what makes a man? I'll tell you what makes a man. A man takes care of the people he loves. A man creates beauty instead of tearing it down. A man isn't afraid to be gentle or show emotion or find joy in simple things. He turned to look at me, and the pain in his eyes was devastating. A man doesn't sit quietly while the people he thought were his friends mock everything he is. The restaurant had gone completely quiet. Even the servers had stopped moving. Jeremy, I whispered, but he shook his head. I'm done, he said. I'm done pretending this is okay. I'm done being apologetic for who I am. And I'm done with people who think cruelty is entertainment. He reached into his wallet and pulled out cash to cover his meal. He placed it carefully on the table, then looked around at each person. I hope you've enjoyed yourselves tonight, he said. I hope making me feel small has made you all feel big. But I'm not going to be part of this anymore. He started to walk away, then turned back one last time. Amelia, he said, his voice breaking slightly on my name. I'll be at home when you decide who you want to be. And then he was gone. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Finally, Carol cleared her throat. Well, she said, that was dramatic. A few people laughed nervously, but the evening was ruined. We finished our meals in uncomfortable quiet. When the check came, I paid my portion and Jeremy's, then made excuses about needing to get home. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept replaying Jeremy's words, seeing the look in his eyes when he'd said he was done. I found him in our bedroom, packing a suitcase. What are you doing? I asked. I'm going to stay at my brother's for a while, he said, without looking up. I think we both need space to figure out what we want. Jeremy, please, I'm sorry about tonight. They were drinking and things got out of hand. It wasn't just tonight, Amelia. He finally looked at me, eyes red-rimmed. This has been building for months. The way you look at me when I talk about my students. The way you change the subject when I'm excited about something. The way you act embarrassed to be seen with me. I wanted to deny it, but he was right. I've been trying to figure out what I did wrong, he continued, folding a shirt carefully. I've been wondering if I should change, try to be more like other men, but tonight made me realize that the problem isn't me. The problem is me, I whispered. The problem is that you're ashamed of who I am, and I can't live with someone who sees me as a disappointment. I won't do that to either of us. He closed the suitcase and picked it up. I love you, Amelia. I have loved you since the day we met, but I won't keep apologizing for being myself. Where does this leave us? I asked. Jeremy paused at the bedroom door. I don't know. I honestly don't know. He left that night, and I didn't see him again for 2 weeks. During that time, I did a lot of thinking. I replayed our entire relationship, seeing it through new eyes. I remembered the woman I'd been when we met, someone drawn to Jeremy's gentleness, his creativity, his ability to find wonder in ordinary moments. Somewhere along the way, I let other people's opinions matter more than my own experience. I let society's narrow definition of masculinity convince me that the man I'd fallen in love with was somehow flawed. When Jeremy finally came home, I was ready to apologize, to tell him I'd been wrong, that I wanted to go back to being the couple we used to be. But Jeremy had made his own decisions during those 2 weeks. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting across from me at our kitchen table. "And I think we should separate, officially." The words hit me like cold water. "Jeremy, no, please. I know I've been awful, but I can change." "It's not about changing, Amelia. It's about respect. Fundamental respect for who I am as a person. And I don't think you have that anymore." I cried then, harder than I'd cried since childhood. I begged him to give us another chance, promised I would do anything. But Jeremy had reached his limit. "I need to be with someone who loves me for who I am," he said gently. "Not someone who loves me despite who I am. There's a difference." The separation became a divorce 6 months later. Jeremy was kind throughout the process, more generous than he needed to be. He never spoke badly about me, never aired our private business. Even in ending our marriage, he maintained the dignity I'd somehow learned to see as weakness. I moved into a studio apartment and threw myself into work. I dated other men who fit society's idea of masculinity better. Men who watched sports and grilled meat and had opinions about cars. Men who never brought me flowers or cried during movies or spent Saturday mornings tending gardens. And I was miserable. It took me almost a year to understand what I'd lost. Jeremy had been right. There is a difference between loving someone for who they are and loving them despite who they are. I'd spent the last years of our marriage trying to change him into someone else. In doing so, I'd lost the man who'd made our home a place of beauty and peace. I'd lost the person who'd listened to my stories like they were fascinating. I'd lost the partner who'd celebrated small joys and found wonder in everyday moments. 3 years later, I heard through mutual friends that Jeremy had started dating someone new. A woman named Claire who taught art at the high school. They'd met at a community theater production where Jeremy provided piano accompaniment and Claire helped with set design. The friend mentioned that Claire seemed to adore Jeremy's sensitivity, his creativity, his gentle nature. She attended his students' recitals and had started her own garden with his help. She appreciated the beauty he brought to ordinary moments instead of seeing it as a character flaw. I felt happy for him and devastated for myself at the same time. That night, I sat in my studio apartment and tried to imagine what my life would have been like if I'd chosen differently. If I'd stood up for Jeremy at that dinner instead of sitting silent. If I'd told my friends that their narrow ideas about masculinity were their problem, not ours. If I'd continued to appreciate the man I'd married instead of wishing he were someone else. But there's no going back from some mistakes. Jeremy had tried to tell me that loving someone means celebrating who they are, not trying to reshape them. I'd learned that lesson too late. I still think about him sometimes, especially in spring when I pass gardens full of roses. I wonder if he still plays piano in the evenings, if he still finds joy in his students' progress, if he still brings flowers to the woman he loves just because they reminded him of her. I hope he does. I hope Claire appreciates all the things about Jeremy that I took for granted. I hope she sees his gentleness as strength, his creativity as a gift, his emotional openness as something rare and precious. Because that's what it was, and I was too blind to see it. The hardest part isn't just that I lost Jeremy, it's that I lost him by trying to change the very things that made him worth loving in the first place. I let other people's limited vision of what a man should be overshadow my own experience of what a good man actually was. Sometimes love isn't about finding someone who fits your preconceived notions. Sometimes it's about expanding your notions to fit the person who's already perfect for you. I learned that lesson 3 years too late, but I learned it nonetheless. And maybe that's worth something, even if it's not enough to undo the damage I caused. Maybe sharing this story will help someone else recognize what they have before they lose it. Maybe someone reading this will choose to defend their partner instead of sitting silent while others mock them. I hope so, because everyone deserves what Jeremy and I had in the beginning. That rare, precious thing where someone loves you not despite your quirks and sensitivities, but because of them. I just wish I'd been wise enough to protect it when it was mine.